Your competitors from Poland are selling in the US. Your competitors from Sweden are selling in the US. They're probably not selling in France. And so when you sell to French customers, you're dealing with a French competitive set for the most part. When you sell in the US, you're dealing with a global competitive set. And that's really valuable. Now there's some tricks you can sell to like Goldman Sachs Paris, and that's kind of helpful because it's an easy way in. I mean, use every leverage you can. Find the French guy at NBC and get him to talk to you, right? Like there's a lot of tricks you can use, but at the end of the day, NBC doesn't buy unless it makes sense for them to buy from you.
Thank you. Thanks, Gil, for this detailed presentation. And for everyone, relax. All of this is a journey, and when you get to signing 300K contracts with one guy, it can be 3-4 years in. Gaetan, you've not talked yet. People don't know you. Maybe you can give us a brief intro of who you are and what Algolia does.
Sure. So my name is Gaetan. I'm the head of sales at Algolia. What is Algolia? We're, if you want to think about us in a very simple manner, we're like a white label Google for websites and mobile applications. If you want to use us, you just go on nbc.com and you start searching and browsing, and we're actually the engine that runs behind and serves the results. We also work with National Geographic and like hundreds and thousands of other websites. In a nutshell, I was the second employee of the company. I started 6 years ago and the first salesperson.
And how large is the company today?
So we're 350 people today, 5 offices, Paris, London, New York, Atlanta, and San Francisco.
Cool. So the subject we want to talk about today is launching sales in the US. So we just got a brief overview of what sales is, but specifically the topic of the US. Algolia has done it long ago, almost at the founding stage, and Gil, you must have helped a lot of founders decide to go there. The question I get most often is, should I be a US company? Should I remain a local company? And if so, when do I decide to expand to a new market? So you probably had many companies that you helped in that decision. What's your kind of framework to know whether it's time, if the timing is right to actually start?
Well, I think I don't think it's safe or wise to be prescriptive about that. Angular's pretty. We actually try to be fairly, prescriptive about this in the sense that we want to invest in companies that are going to the U.S. market because that's where we can be the most helpful. Anne, who's sitting in the front row, runs our platform effort out of New York specifically to make sure that we can help companies in the U.S., which we think is the most exciting target market for enterprise tech. But I think every company has a different journey, and we're in the process of gathering some data from a bunch of founders who've done this. And the data seems to show that most of the founders who've done this are convinced that they are really glad they did it and they wish they'd done it earlier, and the earlier the better, et cetera, et cetera. It's a biased sample because they all did it and succeeded, and so, right? But I think that's what the data seems to show. Another data point is that 95% of the exit value of European enterprise tech startups was created by startups that either moved to the US or raised money from American VCs or both. So those are all companies that were founded in Europe or Israel, but the value comes from the US. Algolia is a prime example of that. So I guess my short answer is, on the one hand, the US is clearly the largest and most attractive and most interesting market for enterprise technology, and we can talk about why that is. And so yes, it makes sense to think about the US really early and try to sell into the US really early. The other thing I would say is that there are many ways to do that, and there's no one right way or one right time or one right formula for doing that. The analogy that I use is, if you want to get a job on Wall Street, you have to wear a suit, but the suit has to fit you. So you can't just buy a suit off the shelf, right? So it's the same thing with going to the US. If you want to be a huge enterprise software company, you have to sell into the US market, but how exactly you do that has to fit your exact company.
Yeah, it does seem that every large company indeed goes there at one point. type of assets, there are also a lot of drawbacks when you go there. It's more difficult to hire, it's more difficult to get access to the first client. So you kind of need some assets to be able to move there successfully. Algolia did it when they entered YC and the founding team split. Do you feel it was too early? Was good timing? Would you have changed anything?
So we started selling in the US from day one. There was many reasons behind that. One of them being when you sell to, I don't know, if you close Fnac here in France, no one knows what Fnac is outside of France. If you close Best Buy, everybody knows what Best Buy is. So the return on those deals is a lot higher. There's also a form of, okay, they sold to the US, so they must be legit. There was a lot of good stuff that would come from selling to the US. Also realized that it was actually easier to sell to American companies than to, at least at the time, French companies. They take a lot more risks. They're very pragmatic in the way they buy. They have a problem, you bring a solution, you seem to be serious, and then they buy. Versus here, it was a lot more difficult. And we knew from day one that the most of our market, the largest market is the US anyways. So we had to do it. So we went to Y Combinator in early 2014. We're almost pre-revenue at that stage. And for the first year and a half after that, we didn't have anyone there. So the assets that you need is good health, because you travel a lot and you take calls super late. You only have, at least that was my understanding, you had to look and feel very available for the people. So I often tell that story where I took a US phone number with an air call. So my signature is a 415 number, which is the area code of San Francisco, but it actually makes my French phone ring. So folks have no idea where I am when they call me. They thought I was in the US. I would take the calls at 1 a.m. at Friday, like on Friday night. I remember that one call with a company that asked me, like Friday, I go to sleep. It's like midnight. I receive that email and the guy says, okay, I'm ready to buy, but I don't really understand the difference between you and SwiftType. I'm like, shit, okay, I'm wearing my PJs. Okay, let's do that. And I ended up with the guy at 1:30 a.m. He had no idea I was not in the Bay Area. But eventually that's those little things that make the difference, not to be there specifically, but to be present and accessible. That's actually like how we did it.
Yeah, I have a friend that works in sales and whose CEO also does the same trick, saying to every client, Nicholas is actually based in San Francisco, he'll be very available.
Yeah, things like, hey, I'll be in New York tomorrow, how about we meet? And then they say yes, and then you book your flight.
Yeah, fake it till you make it. When you decide to launch, you can like be super available, but what are the other steps you would recommend doing to actually assess the market and be able to close the first deals? Would you hire people there? Would you do all the sales remotely as a team, or any other way?
So my take is, and please, everything that I say is us, it's about us, so it's very biased. But I would say you have to do the job yourself first, because otherwise you won't be attractive. Like no one wants to, like coming from Europe, you already start with a huge disadvantage. You're not an American company, so you're a weird animal. So you have to be attractive enough, sexy enough, so that the best people will join the company. So you have to do that job yourself first.
Yeah, I mean, I think the story that Gaetan told about taking the call at 1 a.m. I think is like the essence of this whole thing, right? It's you know, you said kind of move to the U.S. I think a lot of people use the phrase move to the U.S. as if it's going to be a process of moving to the U.S. or hiring in the U.S. I think those are just two possible ways to make this work. You know, I think every single company I've ever invested in that ever had any revenue had U.S. revenue either first or almost first. Within 6 months of their first dollar, they had American money, right? American customer money. But the different ways that they did that were all over the place. There were companies like Front that just moved everybody. They shut Paris down, they moved to San Francisco, and they opened a Paris office like 5 years later, right? It was like everyone's moving or that's it. There are companies that stayed in Israel forever and did everything remotely with a call center, and hired Americans with American accents to work until 4 in the morning, and Germans and French people to sit in Tel Aviv and make calls in local language. Right? There's the classic, CEO moves, CTO stays, split the company like that. Like there's a million ways of doing it. So there isn't a formula. There's just the idea that, maybe the other way to think about it is why would you not do that? Or the question to ask yourself is, well, if you were coming from some random country, or you're coming from space, and you were asked, well, where would you like to incorporate? Where would you like to base your company? And well, what do? I sell enterprise software. Oh, okay. Well, the answer is you probably would wish that you were incorporated in Delaware and were based either in New York or San Francisco, or maybe some other U.S. place. So why would the fact that you're now in the UK or Germany or France mean that you're not going to take advantage of that, or not going to try to do that, particularly when it's so achievable? I would also add that, just to add a few things to what was said, Americans are this weird mix of very open and very ethnocentric at the same time, because it's a multicultural. Trump notwithstanding, I'm not going to comment on that, but my prayers are with us all. But I think it's a country of immigrants, right? And yet they see themselves as the biggest, most important country in the world. And so, if you're not playing by our rules, you're playing a different game, right? And so I think that creates on the one hand, you're right, there's these disadvantages to being foreign, to being weird, to not having gone to Stanford, to having an accent, all those things. On the other hand, they're perfectly willing to deal with companies like that. They are absolutely willing to do it. Much more so in some ways than some European countries, where if you're a German trying to sell in the UK or a Brit trying to sell in Germany, the number one piece of advice I get if you're trying to sell in Germany is, well, you have to hire a German. In the US, I don't think that's true. I think you can sell with an accent in the US. That everyone has an accent in the US. So I think it's a lot more open, a lot more accessible than you think, and a lot easier to do it without following some kind of a formula of, oh yeah, we all have to move and we have to hire some expensive American guy to do this for us. There's a lot of ways to do it.
So what you're both saying is, as soon as you have a chance to sell there, you should start selling there and build that muscle. What are the hurdles you might have internally that would prevent you from doing so? A lot of companies here speak French, for example. I know that becomes a problem when they start scaling. What other things you need to be very careful about, not to compromise the expansion in other countries?
One thing for just one example, I remember Crunchbase. When we closed Crunchbase, the CTO, I could tell he was testing us, because he was sending us, I remember the one day where he sent us an email where he said that the prod was not working or he was having an issue. That was on Saturday evening. And we fixed the thing, and it took forever, but he was testing whether we would be available to fix his problem whenever he needed it. And I think that's the one thing, it's not because you're 9 or 6 hours away that you have to operate on their schedule. So as I said, they don't care about the geography, you have to be present. Therefore, for us, that was one big thing. And you mentioned the language. I think, learn English. That's the one thing. Other than that, no, it's not. Again, it's not rocket science. It's the same thing as selling anywhere.
For everyone notice, at Algolia, everyone speaks English. They've never spoken French.
Yeah, it's one thing that we did from the very beginning. We set up that one rule that says that if you are in the open space, you cannot speak French. It's a constant battle, okay, a big battle. But yeah, because the thing is, we knew that our communication had to be in one language. We would hire folks from everywhere. We knew that Paris would be the hub in Europe, so folks that we would hire, we would have a lot of foreigners in Paris. I think we have maybe 15 different nationalities in Paris. And eventually we would be an American company, so we had to do it from the very, very beginning. The DNA of the company had to be, at least from a language perspective, had to be English.
Do you think it's still that important to be an American company, or you think you can remain a French company legally?
Yeah, us we had to do it for Y Combinator, because they would not invest in non-US or Canada entities. So that's one of the reasons why we flipped the headquarter.
If you're interested in this topic, I have a 50,000 word blog post on it. But the short version is, in practical terms, it makes no actual difference if you're incorporated in France or incorporated in the US. It's not going to stop you from building a billion-dollar company. In more subtle ways, I think it's profoundly important to incorporate in Delaware, for the same reason as it's profoundly important to speak English and write emails in English. It's a cultural signal. It's not that the U.S. is somehow better or the English is somehow better. It's currently the most important market, and currently is the lingua franca of the entire tech world. And you want to send a signal to everyone involved, investors, your own employees, partners, customers, that you are serious, and that when, even in the UK, when an American customer sees, LTD versus Inc., there's a split second of, oh wait, this is foreign to me, this is something else, and this is someone who's not aligning. And by the way, Delaware is the same deal. I'm not from Delaware. I've never been to Delaware. No, I don't know anyone who's ever been to Delaware. I'm not sure Delaware even exists. But it's where everyone in the U.S. incorporates. And the reason why everyone in the U.S. incorporates in Delaware is because everyone incorporates in Delaware. That's actually the reason. It's just, it makes people more comfortable. Because lawyers say, okay, well, since everyone else incorporated in Delaware, there's enough case law there that if we ever actually have a lawsuit, I'm comfortable with that jurisdiction, right? So it's the same principle. And just remind yourself that this is about aligning to reduce friction as opposed to about some national pride. National pride is served if you hire 300 people in Paris, which you can do through Inc. also, right? National pride is served by building huge companies that win markets, and the way to do that is to win globally, and the way to do that is to win in the biggest market, and that currently is the US.
So at that stage, you're US friendly, you're like an American company, you speak English, you have hustled your way through your first clients, mostly led by founders and maybe 1 or 2 employees. At what point do you know you're ready to actually open a new office, hire a sales rep there, start to do actual inside sales and not marketing-led sales?
For us, that's when the CEO moved. That we had one of the founders of members of the founding team there. That's when we started hiring.
So that was after the Series A?
Yeah, that was mid-2015. And we raised our Series A in April 2015.
And I guess you recommend the same sort of...
I hate to be disappointing. I think it depends. I think it really depends. I think every company is going to be different. I think the dangers of hiring, cross-culturally are pretty high. The dangers of hiring in a remote office are really high. The dangers of hiring sales professionals, as I talked about earlier, before they have something that they can sell is really, really high. And the, splitting your team up into multiple offices is super dangerous as well. So when a company says, okay, my first move is going to be to hire a senior salesperson in another country, that's a super high risk move, right? So it's not always a mistake, but you have to be fully aware of all of those risks. And I think what seems to be correlated with success is a sort of a very slow, careful de-risking process that the founders and the CEO and management team undertake themselves together, right? So phase 1 is, can I sell this to a large customer in the US? Or can I sell this to a large customer at all? Then does it work? Are they happy? Then can I sell this to a large customer in the US? Right? And then maybe can I hire someone locally to sell this locally? And then maybe can I hire someone junior in the US who I can manage to help me sell it in the US faster or something? And then maybe do I think I know how to hire a more senior or even a super senior salesperson in the US to do that at the point when I know how to manage that person and I can realistically say, it's kind of easy to hire the salesperson. I think it's much, much harder. I love your perspective on this, by the way, because you live this. But I feel like a lot of startups that I deal with have this moment when the big, expensive senior salesperson or VP sales comes and says, I'm not going to hit quota this year. Who are you at that point to say, well, you could hit quota, right? You're in a much better position to say, well, I hit quota. I'm not even a sales guy. I was doing this with 10% of my time, and I sold 3 accounts. So how can you say with your 10 years of experience and your 400K OTE and your whatever, that you're not able to do this with 100% of your time, right? You're wrong, not me. You're gone. I'm hiring someone to replace you, right? As opposed to, oh, that's okay. Let's push our numbers back and wait, right? So you need to be positioned to have that conversation. You as a CEO, as a founder, need to be able to manage a sales team, and that's a skill in and of itself. So some of the things we're trying to think through as a firm is how do we help train our CEOs and founders to learn how to hire and manage a sales team, because they get railroaded by these people all the time. It's a disaster. But I'd love your take on this.
Yeah, no, very true, everything you said. It's interesting because the profile of the folks that you hire tends to evolve over time. The initial people were very entrepreneurial oriented, and you need those folks because they're the ones who can deal with chaos. And when you launch a new office, you don't have the marketing person, you don't have collaterals, you don't have. There's a lot of things that these people will need to do that go way beyond what a typical salesperson does. One of the first sales folks that I hired, that was a huge mistake. He came from a company called Adderall, which is a pretty large company by our standard of the time. He came and couldn't do shit because he didn't have like the right PDF or the right stuff, or he didn't have a BDR who would do outbound for him, and eventually he didn't have the whole engine around him, so we had to let him go. And we started hiring slowly, like more entrepreneurial people, and then slowly build the engine so that the folks who are more experienced could thrive in our organization. And it went even as far as in New York, the first hire in New York was, the profile we were looking for was someone who came from a large company because we wanted somebody who had experience selling large deals and who had been trained by like in a seasoned sales environment. But that person had to be also very entrepreneurial. So we found Chip. His name is Chip Lewis. He was the first salesperson for Marketo in New York. He stayed at Marketo for 7 years. So for us, that was all good signs. So he did go through chaos, was successful, and was loyal to the company for 7 years. So for us, that was the perfect fit. And the guy is still with us today. We promoted him to manage the whole commercial team on the East Coast. So that goes like as far as that. It's that granular in terms of the skills that the hard skills and the soft skills that you need. And from a management standpoint, something that we realized recently is that there's also phases of companies that fit certain leaders. Like for instance, we had one head of sales in the US for 2 years, realized after 2 years, as our sales process was becoming a bit more complex, our funnel was not just inbound driven, we had to start relying on partners. It was a bit more sophisticated and complex sales environment. That person had not developed those skills, and that was not his really liking. So we decided to part ways, and what he told me when he left, he told me I'm a Series B to Series C guy. Like literally, he knew that he thrives in spans of 2 years after once the companies have raised their Series B, and knows that post Series C, that's not his world. So it was also a good lesson for us, because after that we had to find like an SVP of sales who had known environments that were 50 to 100 or 200 million in ARR, and who had been through that sort of like more complex sales environment. So long answer to your question, but it's like at every stage there's a certain profile of person that you need.
Can I ask him more about Chip? Yeah. So I'm curious about Chip. How did you find Chip? How did you convince Chip to join your company? And why did he join from his perspective? Because he was, you're describing him as very successful at a great company. You guys were a young startup.
He was losing the entrepreneurial environment that he liked at the beginning or for the first few years at Marketo, was not there anymore. So I think he and for us that was a great thing, because we're like, okay man, like we're creating the New York office, you're gonna be the first one, like it's gonna be on you. So it was something that really like excited him. How did we find him? Like through like external recruiters, I think.
The type of people you want in your company early on.
it's also the type of people that you lose if you don't pay attention. Like if you build too many processes around those people, they feel like they're just here to apply rules and processes, and then they go. And it's a breed of people that you want to keep, because they're the ones who, like part of the ones who like drive innovation. They're the ones who have the most grit. They will do things that you don't think, that are not on their job description, and they're the ones who can make the company move forward as well.
And so opposite to the first ones, these ones you want to give a bit more leeway, and you don't want to just tell them, I'm able to do it. You just do what I was doing before. How do you adapt culturally to attract that type of talent? I mean, just American talent? You just have to do it.
I think when you open an office in San Francisco, more San Francisco than New York, it's a big slap in the face in terms of things that, especially when you come from a European background and French background, humor is very different. There's like concepts in the Bay Area that are way like in the future for us, I think, from here. Like things like, genderless communication is a big thing now. Like in certain companies, you cannot write she or he or anything. It has to be neutral. So for us, it seems like here, for some people, it seems like it's something from space, but actually it's something very different. So it's great to have a presence in the Bay Area, because it also teaches you about what's coming up in the future. So that's also one way that we adapted the culture of the company. Little things like that.
You mentioned pricing a couple times in your presentation, saying it was one of the most complicated things. Do you think it relates to the geographies in which you operate, or is it just?
At some point it does. So the thing is, when you expand internationally, so you do Europe, you do US, you do Japan, you do Australia, all those geographies have pretty much the same like GDP per capita, so they're used to buying the things at pretty much the same price. Where it can start getting tricky is when you sell to India, where like some companies adapt their pricing to those regions, but otherwise, no, it's the same pricing everywhere.
So that would be pricing based on how much clients can pay, and not so much on how your sales structure is built. Like the average salesperson here makes maybe 100K if they're successful. In the US, they can go up to $1 million. You probably need to sell a much higher product, higher price product there.
Yeah, I think the thing, like, all in all, even though we pay less in France, there's more taxes in France than in the US. So for the company, I wouldn't say it's pretty much the same, but we're close.
Okay. Do you have anything to add on pricing?
I think pricing is complicated, and we were chatting about this earlier. I think you could probably do a whole day on pricing, but it's complicated not because of geography. It's complicated because pricing is it's an uncomfortable topic, and it's a complicated topic with a lot of different options, and it's perceived correctly to kind of directly drive your revenue, and it's also, sort of on some level, it's often the reason why a sale doesn't close, because it's mispriced, or right. So and I think it's also something that once you set it, you're very, very reluctant to mess with it, even though you probably, you were saying that you've revised pricing a few times. So I think it's for a bunch of reasons that I'm not sure I fully understand. It's way more complicated than a lot of other things. It's way more complicated than people think it's going to be. And everyone seems always blindsided by how complicated it is. Right? I'm not sure why that is, but I think it's something that's extremely hard to get right in the beginning. Whereas other things like UX, sometimes a company just comes out with great UX on day one. I've never seen a company come out with the right pricing on day one, almost never. I don't know why that is. You'd think it would be the opposite, right?
We sell, like us, for instance, we're very horizontal, so we can sell to media sites, to SaaS software, to e-commerce. So our value for each one of those industries vary, so we cannot have one pricing that will make everybody happy. So there's that part, the outside part, but then you said it like internally, when you set a target for your enterprise rep at 1.5 million a year, the average deal size cannot be 20K. It's impossible. So you have to make sure that there's some sort of anchor in your pricing at around 150 or 200K. A 1.5 million rep closes about 10 deals a year. So you have an average to be at 150 or 200K. So that's also one thing you need to keep in mind, that the way you design your sales team, like in your capacity plan, affects your pricing as well. There's so many variables.
And I think it also requires, I think, a lot of empathy with the world of the salesperson, I think, which is very hard for founder types to internalize. That if you think about, we look at a sales guy who's doing a $1.2 million rep is taking home, what, 400, 500?
No.
300?
In the US, yeah.
Right. So we look at someone who's making 300 or more, right, as, oh, they're doing really well, but they're really stressed because they're used to they have a lifestyle that requires them to make 300 plus a year, and they start the year thinking, well, if I exceed target, I might be able to do $500,000 this year. That's how they start the year. That's their life, right? And so when you change pricing on them, for example, or you delay a product release feature, you are messing with they signed up to make 300 to 500 a year from you, right? And they're also going to bullshit you on their sales targets because they want you to set their quota low so they can exceed quota and get the accelerator. So there's this very complicated dance that, on the other hand, you can't live without them. I mean, you need, there's not that many people that can do that, so they have leverage in this equation, and they feel like they're out there battling for you all the time, and your company survives or dies because of their efforts, and that if you don't compensate them adequately, and also they have relationships, right? They are using their relationships that they've built in many cases over years to convince people to take meetings and use software that's not fully ready all the time and all these other things. If they feel underappreciated or misunderstood, they're just going to go find someone else who's going to pay them 300K to do $1.2 million in quota, right? So that is not a normal employee relationship the way any of us have ever experienced, and that's just weird, right? So understanding that, and you as a CEO or a founder have a very different, like 2 years ago, you were struggling to pay yourself anything, right? And so all of a sudden you're dealing with people like this. And so it requires a lot of empathy to understand what you're getting yourself into. And I think that's part of the reason why avoiding those people in the early stages is, I think, pretty important, because they're just bringing a DNA which you're going to have to bring in eventually, but which is just so different from the DNA that got you to where you are right now that you need to inject that very carefully. I don't know if that resonates.
100%.
I dated a saleswoman, so I learned this. I'm no longer with her.
Are there any channels that help getting meetings with potential clients? I know the YC network, for example, works pretty well. Are there any other shortcuts that one can take?
We try to help. I mean, Anne and I do a lot of work to try to use our network as aggressively as possible. We have a database and all this stuff. I think what I should be doing is selling you guys on how great Angular is at helping companies with sales, and we really do try. But I think the reality is that companies have to forge their own paths, and that's the essence of the work. And so if a company's going to rely on someone externally, and by the way, the same thing is it's true for VCs. No VC is going to save your target, right? No VC is going to make enough introductions for you to actually make a difference, right? Maybe the early stages we can make 1 or 2 intros that might end up converting into huge accounts, and that happens. But once you get going, no one's going to save you. You have to save yourself. And I think the same is true for for channels, right? I get, because of the centrality of sales, I as an investor, and I think you guys as founders should get super nervous when there's some big channel partner that kind of shows up and they're going to help you. They're not going to help you. They're motivated by their own issues, right? And there's been a lot of cases that I've been pretty close to where a huge channel partner falls apart, or where things go sour, or where the guy who was running the channel partnership disappears. And so what seems to be highly correlated with successful outcomes is when a company has control over its own destiny, right? So what is a great email to get as a VC is, hey, I'm in an early sales process with this company. Do you know anybody senior in this department? Can you help us? We're looking for some, or do you know anyone on the board? And probably I don't know anyone on the board of like General Motors, but maybe I do, right? But a terrible email to get is like, hey, we need leads. Okay, like what do you want me to do? Like go through LinkedIn and search for like what, developers? Like what do you want, right? So if a and because one is like a very like they're in control of their destiny and they're running a process and they're saying, okay, how can you help me with this process? The other one's I don't have a process, I don't have a lead book, I'm underwater, introduce some customers. Like I can try, but if I'm in that position, you're already losing, right? That's not going to work in the long run.
It's something that we did. So every month we would send our board members short list of 30 accounts, our 30 top priority accounts for the quarter. That was one thing. But obviously the other thing is your marketing team that for us drives a lot of inbound. Channel, I don't think we did any channel up until about a year ago because we didn't even know how to sell. Like literally we change our pricing once a year. We change, like it's a moving target. So how can you teach a channel person how to do it if even yourself you're not in a very repeatable model? Like if your sales process seems too complicated to anything, the channel won't do it for you. And plus we still wanted to keep the relationship with the account because we learned so much by interacting with the account. What is the upsell opportunities, there's a lot of leverage to keep the direct relationship with the account.
Yeah, all of that I see very often at the early stage. The best founders never give the keys of the car to anyone else, and they save themselves. And whether you're here or not, they will succeed. It's true for hiring, it's true for getting clients, it's true for fundraising, it's true for most of the processes. What do you wish you had known when you launched the US that you know now? Like things that went really wrong?
I was born in the US, I'm still trying to figure out the rules to American football, so.
I don't know. Maybe like what I mentioned earlier, like the very specific difference of profiles that you need at the different stages, probably. I would say that's one thing. How do you adapt the culture of the company? And then from a larger org standpoint, I wish I had built a sales ops team way earlier, because we had very early we had a heavily distributed team globally. Now we have reps in Paris, London, like all the offices I mentioned, but we still don't have like a cohesive process across the board, and that's one of the jobs of a sales ops team. You don't want your folks in the US to sell differently than the folks in Europe. You want to make sure that you have knowledge transfer between the locations. If one deal closes in the US, you have to teach immediately the European folks how, like the specifics of that deal. And it's something that we took too long, I think, to implement. So I would say ops earlier, processes a little bit earlier, knowledge management as well earlier. Yeah.
So as you said, invest in the tooling.
Yeah.
Cool. Guys, do you have questions? Many.
So I'll give you this microphone. This is a microphone, even though it's a cube. You can throw it to the next person. It's super soft, so don't worry. It won't kill you. Okay? So you start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the talk. It was really interesting. Question for you, Gaetan. You said a few minutes ago that you didn't do channel sales up until a year ago or so. And the reason for that was that you didn't know yet what you were selling exactly, if I quote you. So what did it take for you to know, okay, that's it, we know what we're selling, and we know how someone through channel sales could sell it for us?
It's not so much that I didn't know what we were selling, it's just that you're constantly adapting the way you're selling. So you discover new use cases, you So the fact that you're in constant discovery mode makes it challenging to just train a channel partner, because that means that we would need to retrain them pretty much every month.
And so what box did you need to tick to feel comfortable selling through channels?
But even today, we don't sell. We do co-selling with some partners or other software vendors. We don't have any reseller today.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's going to be a tough one.
Hello. Hello. Where are you? Okay. Hi, it's a question for Gil, or Jill, so I'm sorry. So you mentioned a really interesting topic regarding culture in the US for buyers. And that's actually very interesting because we've experienced both situations where they're really open to work with software providers from France who might be innovative, but also the other way around where some American companies still have this perception that in Europe we're in the Stone Age and we don't have internet and running water. So how do you explain that differences sometimes in the quality of the discussions with enterprise companies? So
look,
maybe it's too universal.
I think it's too universal, but I think it's a good question. And I think maybe the more generalized version of the answer is that one of the features of, as you move up that chart towards larger and larger deal sizes, you also move towards fewer customers per dollar of revenue that you as a company are, but also fewer customers in the world, and they become more and more unique, right? There's only 4 or 5 aircraft manufacturers in the world. There's only a few hundred oil and gas companies, right? There's a lot of e-commerce, right? So the more you go up the enterprise stack in terms of larger and larger deal sizes, larger and larger companies, there's going to be fewer of them, and they're going to be more particular, and they're going to have their own needs and their own cultures and their own issues. There are companies that are open to innovation. There are companies that are not. There are individual people who are just not going to buy externally. There are people and as I was fundraising, even for my own fund, I would experience this where, I had one guy who was like, I love your deck, I love your thesis, I think everything you're doing is brilliant, but I'm not going to invest in you. And I was like, why not? And it was like, because I don't know anyone who knows you. Okay, that's legit. Like his process was a certain thing, and he didn't know anyone who knows me, and that's fine, right? And so I think qualifying them out is the key. And I think the answer is not, why are the question is not why are some customers open or not open. I think the question is, why are you not qualifying those out faster, right?
Interesting. Thank you.
More generally, do you optimize for conversion or do you optimize for more leads?
You optimize for revenue, I think, right? And you optimize for long-term revenue, and I think that goes back to the graph I showed, or the chart I showed, where you had quality matters. So Best Buy matters. I'd rather have 100K from Best Buy than 300K from a company no one's ever heard of, right? And because that has knock-on effects on other things, right? In funding and other customers and all kinds of other things. The other thing it does is that there's this obsession that people have with reference customers. It's not a completely shallow thing. It's a real thing, right? Everyone is trying to sell Best Buy. Right? It's a big, juicy target. It's a sexy brand. All of Algolia's competitors are out there trying to sell Best Buy, trying to sell NBC.com. And being able to win those logos, particularly as a young startup from France, shows a lot, right? And it's going to have a knock-on effect on making a lot of sales down the line easier later, right? So also those customers are going to know your competitors better than some random company that hasn't met your competitors, right? So you also learn something from winning them. When you talk to NBC and they say, no, I'm not going to buy you because I'm using Algolia and they're better than you because they have this feature, you learn something. Like, oh, right, I understand now what I have to say to rip these guys out of my competitors' hands, right? You learn from those encounters, and so those customers are the ones you want to go for. So I would optimize for revenue, but I would optimize for long-term revenue, and I think some of these optimizing for logos is really important. And I think that also gets to why the US matters, because your competitors from Poland are selling in the US. Your competitors from Sweden are selling in the US. They're probably not selling in France. And so when you sell to French customers, you're dealing with a French competitive set for the most part. When you sell in the US, you're dealing with a global competitive set. And that's really valuable. Now there's some tricks you can sell to like Goldman Sachs Paris, and that's kind of helpful because it's an easy way in. I mean, use every leverage you can. Find the French guy at NBC and get him to talk to you, right? Like there's a lot of tricks you can use, but at the end of the day, NBC doesn't buy unless it makes sense for them to buy from you.
Yes, I have a question leading to prescription or advice related to the dimension we were missing in the graph of deers and elephants, which is velocity. Everybody's watching us, and we are watching ourselves about how quick we can make the first income. We're very fortunate. We've had our first euros being dollars from large corporations in the US. But hey, it takes so much time to get the second, the third, the fifth large account. And so what is your advice in terms of ABM, account-based marketing tips or else to make those decisions faster from their standpoint? Do you see that changing, or should we turn ourselves towards smaller accounts to make our numbers?
I would say if they have a problem, I mean, I identify the folks who have the problem you solve, and then they have their own internal buying process and testing processes, and I guess once you have identified the account that has the issue, that you have a champion in place who can help you, walk through the account, understanding the buying process. For us, in the enterprise segment, which we define by 5,000 employees and above, I would say that our average cycle is probably 6 to 9 months. A mid-market, we try to keep it under 5 months, so it's more closely to 3 to 5 months. And SMB is a lot more transactional. So that's what we try to stick to. ABM, we do some of it. It works a little bit, I would say. I don't think it's been like a revolution for us. We tried different hacks, but once the idea is just being able to identify the right pool of people who have the problem that you solve, and then start those conversations. There's no magical like receipt here, but I would say if a 20K deal takes 9 months, you may have an issue. It may be very expensive then to build a sales organization that does that. But if you are like 3 to 5 months for 50K and maybe like 6 to 9 months for like 150, 200K, I guess, at least from my standpoint, I think it's fine.
I would, I guess, add that I can't give you advice. I don't know enough about what you're doing, but I think and I'm happy to talk offline about it. But I think what I would advise you to do is look at your sales challenge as sort of yet another engineering problem, where you may be missing some data about, if you only have one customer, you don't really know a lot about repeatability, but you can probably impute some things or make some educated guesses about repeatability. And so the two pieces of advice are, number one, be hyper honest with yourself about what actually drove the sales cycle length and what actually drove the deal size and what's the actual profitability of that deal, and do I want more of those or not, right? And the second advice is to think about it as an engineering problem where you're optimizing a bunch of levers. How would things change if you looked for smaller customers or bigger customers, or lowered your price, or sold a more simple version of your software, or just for example, sometimes when I it's just like advice that's worthless because I don't. But one example, right? A lot of times I'll be talking to a company that has some very complicated, very long sales cycle on some really large ticket item. And it turns out that they're selling, let's say, 300K of software and 300K of services, and it takes them 12 months. And sort of the standard cookie cutter VC advice for that case, which usually actually works, is to say, well, what if you just sold 300K of software licenses, or even 150K of software licenses, and then you just go to Ernst & Young or go to Deloitte and say, you guys do the implementation. Take the 450K. I don't want it. You take it, right? I'll just sell 150K at a 90% gross margin in a 2-month sales cycle to you guys, and you go off and sell this. I will sell the account, I'll drop it off in your hand, and I'm happy for you to make 75% of the deal size. And you can take your 20% margin, and I'll take my 90% margin on a quarter of the deal, right? But now that doesn't work if a VC is saying, all I care about is your top line, right? So you have to be very honest with yourself and with your investors and what you're trying to do. But it's an engineering problem, because you can probably sell 10 of those faster than you can sell 2 of the other one, right?
Thanks. So I had a question about the profiles that you hire in the beginning of the adventure, the profiles you hire before you hire the shark sales. Those guys that are more entrepreneurial. I'm really curious about what happens to them. Like this Chip guy, aren't you worried that he's going to be bored after some point, or is that okay with you, that maybe he's going to go to some other entrepreneurial company after 6 years?
I would say there's one thing that never ends is getting new challenges. So you put those people on new challenges. I think it's pretty easy to feed them. Like, our days are full of problems to solve. So I think I will never run out of problems to solve. So I think once you put those people on new challenges, for instance, Chip, he's the first one leading a commercial team. Like, we've created a commercial segment, and he's the one leading it. So I think it's pretty cool, super exciting for him. And he's still the most tenured employee in the New York office. So that also puts him in a position where he's the entrepreneur, he's the founding member of our New York office. So I think this, I pray that he will stay long, but I think this will help us keep him. And the other ones, yeah, you just keep them on challenging stuff. You need to give them enough room to breathe and enough space to thrive. And some of them, you just lose them. There's people who just do not recognize themselves in companies at that scale. That's it. Like, they just, even like the word process, they just cannot stand it. So they just go and you lose it. It's not it's a natural process. It's sad, but it's just a natural process.
It happens to founders as well. I mean, there's a lot of cases of founders just like, I can't deal with this anymore. I'm happy to leave money on the table. I want to go back to start another startup. They're just not happy, and it's a natural part of. I'm specifically talking about founders that they themselves decide to leave the companies that they themselves started. That we would love them to stay, but they just can't do it anymore.
And you said shark sales. You always want to hire people who are hungry as hell. So whether in sales, whether in other functions, when I say entrepreneurial, I just don't want the scrappy dude. Like, I want someone who wants to achieve stuff. And that translates later on with folks who want to close a lot of money. But earlier, it's folks who want to build a sales function. But if they don't close, they're out still.
Thank you very much for the talk. I mentioned to Gaetan that it was a very timely way to start January. Gil, I actually wanted to bring up something which you mentioned before, which was that sales should run the product rather than product. And I would imagine that if there's more product people here, there might have been a little bit more of a gasp. I was curious kind of how you see a healthy enterprise sales and product relationship in your portfolio companies and companies that you've looked at.
Sure. So let me correct myself. I do not think that sales should run product. But I do think that companies should make room for sales to have a lot of input on product, and that CEOs should be asking themselves, if my salespeople were running product, what would they prioritize? Right now, you can go prioritize something else because you have a longer vision and a better understanding of where the market's going than your head of sales might have. But I think that in a really well-functioning company, sales has a front row seat at the table, and at some point you have to be a sales-driven organization, right? There is going to be a date when the only thing that's going to matter is your revenue growth and your profitability, right? Both of which are functions of your sales machine. So it's, I think we've been through a lot of years of fetishizing founders and fetishizing product, and I think it's completely appropriate to give sales an equal place at the table and say, hey, are there any features that you guys need that would make it easier for you guys to sell? And there may be some features that the CEO really wants to put in because it shows a direction or allows him or her to close a strategic account. But there may be features that junior salespeople are really eager to have because they're losing deals because of those features, and they're not getting prioritized because they're not sexy or some boring integration to some other system, and right, it's not considered a priority. And those things accumulate over time. And so unless sales is in the room, how are you going to know that? How are you going to know that you need to hire more back-end engineers to build the SAP integration? Unless it's not sexy, no one wants to talk about it, it's not interesting, it's not fun, but you're not going to hit your number because you need, at some point, you need bulk to hit those numbers, right? So you know, that's what I'm trying to say, that it's CEOs need to be able to wear both hats.
Well, one or two more.
Yes, I have a question for both of you. How did you manage the trade-off between inside sale and external sale? Because you are not based in the US, so were you more traveling to the US more often, or were you more trying to find customers in internet or in social media or telephone? So how did you make this trade-off?
I would say, so our sales team today is still mostly in our hubs. For us, like the difference between like inside sales and field reps. Field reps would be folks who would just be working out of their hometown, or so us, they're all in the offices. We're lucky because our target industries are in those locations. So a lot of folks on the East Coast, in the US and in San Francisco, and in Europe anyway, it's mostly London and Paris. And then when they need to travel, they do travel. So that's how that works. Our mid-market people, SMB and mid-market people, rarely travel. It's like most of those deals, even if they reach 6 figures, we close them over Zoom. So there's still a lot of interactions with our solution engineers and the reps, but there's like little on-site, very few on-sites. Enterprise is a bit more on-sites because you have to, like sometimes there's panels and stuff like that, you have to build a relationship, it's longer stuff. And they're used to having folks come to their offices to sell and build a relationship. So I would say the folks who travel the most would be mostly our enterprise people.
I was just going to say, this is what I meant when I sort of said your ARPA is your destiny, right? Like, and you might have multiple ARPAs, so you might have multiple kinds of sales motions, but depending, you know, if you know what your ARPA is, you know what your industry you're selling into, that will generally drive a ton of these decisions for you.
Last one, yeah.
Thanks. So just one question regarding a relationship to investors, so you can probably both answer that one. I have the impression that the elephant category should be like approached or viewed by investors differently than other SaaS companies who sell more to SMBs or even to bigger enterprise that deals above $1 million. And I have the impression that VCs look at companies in that space either like one or like the other, but not as elephants. What I mean by that is that when you do deals between 100K and 300K, some investors have a tendency to look at them, oh, they should close fast because they look at it like a mid-market sales type of company, or oh, they should sell more expensive. And how do you deal with setting those expectations with investors so they understand that you are in that category? Sorry, it was a bit long. Is it clear? I mean,
I think I understand what you're asking. I think what you're saying, let me see if I understand the question. I think your question is, when you show up in an investor meeting and your ARPA is sort of hovering between 100 and 300, you feel like you're getting pressure, either go way faster because your ARPA is small or increase your deal size to make it larger, right? And I think you're saying that's frustrating to you because you feel like the right ARPA for your business is in that level, and they're not understanding your dynamics. Is that?
Yeah, or we should be looking at that segment as a segment on its own and not compare it either with those other companies or with the other ones.
Right. So I mean, look, I think there's almost always a range, right? So I think that's a logarithmic axes, right? So you're usually within some kind of a band on that range. It can be hard to have $10,000 accounts and $1 million accounts. I suspect you have that, or close to it, right? You have. I'd love to. I don't know if you publicly announce it, but I'd love to know what the minimum is and the maximum ARP is for a company like yours. But I suspect it's a pretty big range. And so I think it depends also what stage you're talking about. If you're at a stage of you're trying to convince people that you are scaling, right, then you have to be doing a certain thing and showing them that you're scaling that thing. So if you have salesmen that know how to close, between 100K and 250K accounts, then you need to show that I can hire these people, I can train these people, I can bring them online relatively quickly, I understand how to forecast, I can manage the pipeline, I can scale that operation, give me money, I'll hire more of them. That's basically what you're saying. If you're talking about, and that could be true at $1 million level, it could be true at a $10,000 level. If you're talking about sort of the Series A kind of stage, right, or even before that, you're really talking about what's possible, not what you're doing. You're trying to convince people this is what's possible, right? And so I actually think it's totally reasonable for an investor to explore those boundaries with you, to say, wait, at the lower price points, can you go faster? But to also at the same time ask you, given that people are already willing to pay you 6 figures, maybe they'll pay you more. How do you know that you haven't charged, that you're charged enough, right? How do you know that you're not going to have $1 million account, right? Or to flip it around, are you saying you will never charge more than 300K, right?
That's where I struggle, because a lot of investors, they're not willing to go explore those boundaries with the founders. They'd rather leave you on the side or let other investors take that risk, because they know it's a risk exploring, selling very expensive and not selling at all, or saying smaller accounts but not reaching targets,
I mean, look, I think it's, so I agree with you, there's a lot of bad investors out there, there's no argument there, but I think, I sort of feel like it's the founder's job to push those boundaries, and it's the founder's job to plant flags on those various hills, right? So for example, the reason those 4 vectors I think are helpful, at least as a framework for me, is because, like, imagine you're a seed stage investor or a Series A investor, and someone comes to you and says, I have one company who's paying me 300K, some logo I've never heard of, but it's 300K a year recurring and probably going to grow next year. I have a lot of accounts paying me, between 1 and 10,000, 1 and 20,000 a year, and that seems to be growing pretty quickly. Oh, and I also have Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch using this. They're not paying yet. I'm hoping that I'll be able to convert them soon. But they love it, and you can talk to them as reference customers, right? And your total revenue is like, nothing. Your total revenue is 400K. That's pretty impressive, right? You've got amazing logos, which proves that you've been selected by leading customers in your industry. You've proven that you can plant a flag on a really high value hill, right? If you can sell one time 300K, you can probably sell 300K again, unless it's some kind of a weird deal, but let's assume that it's not, right? You might even be able to get more for that if there's larger customers out there that are going to use the same thing. Plus, you seem to have some other aspect of your product that maybe developers are downloading and using self-service, and that's scaling effectively, and you're doing that efficiently too, right? I would look at that and invest and say, wow, that's really, really impressive, right? If on the other hand, you've got this kind of muddy picture where you have like ARPU of blah, and like it's not really growing, and there's no customers in there that I recognize, and they're all in southern Poland or something. There's nothing there to sink my teeth into, even if it's growing reasonably, right? So ideally, you'll show one of those dimensions, maybe more than one of those dimensions, and that would be more helpful, right? So you're sort of asking someone to believe a story of growth, so you have to give them some reason to believe it.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks to both of you. We'll stay around for a couple minutes if you guys have time.
Yeah, thank you.
Amazing.
Que la famille.